Night Shyamalan has been going through a bit of a reputational renaissance recently, having at one time been billed as the next Spielberg before falling into a career-defining slump that he's now, hopefully, coming out of. Here I'm mainly looking at the film that really derailed Shyamalan, the film where he cast himself as Jesus. Lady in the Water is a film released in 2006 that comes up as the known-for example when writing M Night Shyamalan into IMDb, and for his producing it no less. Bizarre, especially considering that it's probably his least known work after Praying with Anger and Wide Awake. What are you up to, IMDb? Anyway, it didn't make any money, and it got roasted. That's because the film is pretty much this scene, with occasional breaking of the fourth wall to tell the audience how much people don't get M. Night's art.
We can't just stand here playing make-believe. I wanted to believe more than most. I want to be like a child again.
Now let me tell you where I'm coming from. A lot of the information that I got for this video about the production of Lady in the Water comes from this book, written by Michael Bamberger. Bamberger was there through much of the production and post-production of Lady, and he's a self-confessed M. Night Shyamalan fan, but he presents a very fair, if restrained look at all of the problems on the shoot and with Shyamalan and his process. Me personally, I'm not very much a fan of Shyamalan's work. I do like some of his films, but I respect him as a filmmaker. I think he does tension really well, and I especially respect that he tries to do new things. Nevertheless, this video is about how Shyamalan sabotaged himself because of issues of ego. Lady in the Water began life as a bedtime story that Shyamalan would tell his children. It follows a kind of mermaid, here called a Narf, who becomes stranded in the swimming pool of an apartment complex. The residents of the building try to help the Narf get back to her world by interpreting a number of signs and acting out a kind of ritual, whilst trying to evade a creature called a Scrunt. It often feels, especially with its use of music, as if it's meant to be a magical kids' film, but it's hard to follow, and whilst usually fast-paced, it's too talky for kids.
He is someone who sees meaning in the ordinary.
Does anyone have any idea who this is?
My God. I do.
It's a bizarre film that you can easily rip apart, although perhaps not for the usual reasons. The acting is fine, it looks fine, the CGI isn't great, but it's not that bad. The problem is it's not very coherent. The only tone is projected bewilderment. It never connects. I never know what Shyamalan really wants us to feel. The Madam Narf. What?
Could you look up the word Narf for me?
It's an Eastern bedtime story, Mr. Heap. She told me about a bad guy in story. These creatures are called Scrunts. They're meant to kill a Narf when she is out of the water. 1,000 Narfs is about a rare Narf who comes once in a generation of a Narfs who is called the Madam Narf. Her vessel is important. This vessel will cause change. But it is the Madam Narf herself that is truly the key.
But to understand why Shyamalan went from restrained, considered, coherent movies to Lady, which doesn't feel as well-crafted directorially or narratively as his previous films, you have to realise that in Shyamalan's mind, he was already on the decline. The Sixth Sense wasn't Shyamalan's first film, but it was a very early film released on his 29th birthday. It was an enormous hit, grossing $670 million on a $40 million production budget, catapulting Shyamalan from jobbing young director to star in his own right. The Sixth Sense is, even now, often considered Shyamalan's peak. His following movie, Unbreakable, was received well at the time, but also, at the time, it was called derivative by some critics. That has to hurt, to be called derivative of your own work. And inevitably, it didn't make as much money as The Sixth Sense. In fact, Unbreakable and The Village didn't make half as much money. This might well sound alarm bells, and I think it did with Shyamalan, but there's a critical factor. How could it? The Sixth Sense was a phenomenon. Kids were saying, "I see dead people," at the same time as Timmy. It was part of the cultural zeitgeist. No director, not even Spielberg, can make every film E.T. or The Sixth Sense. I think it's helpful to look at this visually. See YouTube, original content right here. You can see that Shyamalan's movies all did well. Really, they did very well. But having listened to M. Night talk about movies and having read Bamberger's book, I'm sure a graph like this wouldn't make Shyamalan feel better. He wanted to be back on top, even though he didn't really ever leave the top. And I think that's really what Lady in the Water boils down to. He didn't want it to be as good as The Sixth Sense, he wanted it to eclipse The Sixth Sense. He wanted it to be the greatest film ever made. Nothing wrong with that. Good for you. But I don't think that's really true. I don't think he wanted Lady to be the greatest film ever made as much as he wanted to be the greatest filmmaker there ever was. And I can say that because of the way he handled Nina Jacobson and Disney. M. Night Shyamalan had, for as long as he was the M. Night Shyamalan people know, the one born with The Sixth Sense, produced his works through Disney, and with Disney bigwig Nina Jacobson. And if you want another example of why Hollywood is a place that you should abandon all hope before entering, look what happened to her. Anyway, Nina Jacobson and the man who would later fire her, Dick Cook, didn't like the script for Lady in the Water at all. Anyway, Cook and Jacobson had problems with the script, but Shyamalan had proven himself to be very bankable, and like I said, Jacobson and Shyamalan had a very established relationship. Shyamalan saw the notes that Jacobson offered as proof that she didn't really believe in him or his vision. He said Disney were too critical of his script, and that they didn't really want a filmmaker. They wanted a hack who would do what he was told. Nina Jacobson, on the other hand, has said that she was just trying to give honest feedback, so that the script could be whipped into the best possible shape before leaving pre-production. A meeting between Shyamalan and Disney executives, including Jacobson and Cook, ended with M. Night more or less severing ties. But here's the thing, and this is not an exaggeration. Disney said explicitly that they didn't get the script, but that they believed in him, and they would give him $60 million to do what he wanted, and they would see him at the premiere. That's the dream, isn't it? The dream no one dreams of because it's all so unlikely. $60 million and free reign. The world might have gotten the dark remake of Porky's it's been calling for. Get Aronofsky on the blower. Tell him to get his head out. The way Bamberger makes it sound, and again this is someone who had intimate access to the director, it seems as though Shyamalan was deeply hurt by Jacobson's criticisms, and that he never managed to escape those criticisms all through production. It seems, without Jacobson really intending to, she got in his head.
Goodbye, Mr. Heap.
He was hurt because he wanted it to be brilliant. Instantly brilliant. He didn't want Disney to develop the script, he wanted Disney to sing his praises. So he left and took it to Warner Brothers. They, and specifically WB executive Alan Horn, didn't necessarily get Shyamalan's script either, but they offered the path, not of least resistance, but least criticism. Not even that, least doubt. But the doubt in his own mind was there, and it was always there, and you can see that in the handling. Lady in the Water is only pretending to be an artist's piece for themselves. Really, it's motivated by the concerns of others. Shyamalan's self-esteem and his need to validate the image of himself is what drives this movie. Here's what I mean.
A boy in the Midwest of this land will grow up in a home where your book will be on the shelf and spoken of often. He will grow up with these ideas in his head. This boy will become leader of this country. He will speak of you and your words. Your book will be the seeds of many of his great thoughts.
He cast himself as what is essentially the third role, behind Paul Giamatti and Bryce Dallas Howard, and he plays a writer who we're told in the future will publish a novel about his opinions of the problems in the world and how to fix them. Shyamalan's character is important, we're told, because the novel that he's writing will one day be read by a little boy who will be inspired and will change the world for the better. Not only is that akin to something a teenager would write, any uncertainty about the veracity of all of this never comes into play, and the fact that he cast himself as the person who changes the world through their art, it's almost as bad as the part with the critic. The film has a film critic, or a straw man of one, and Shyamalan doesn't beat around the bush in letting us know exactly what he thinks.
There is no originality left in the world, Mr. Heap. That is a sad fact I've come to live with.
Well, I will shut the door, and you will land a fraction of a second too late.
There's also, I believe, there was a little attack at a film critic in the movie here, was there not?
Well, I'm trying to think back on it, the story. It was interesting because the movie is about storytelling. It's about how people relate to stories, the lost art of stories, and how we listen to them. And I knew that it needed to be a character that was an expert in stories, and that he would stop learning. Whereas Paul's character was willing to learn and listen like a child and believe in things. This guy didn't believe in anything, and so it was a wonderful thing to have Bob Balaban play the film critic.
Hey, Steven Spielberg, I really enjoyed Saving Private Ryan, but what would you say to people who suggest that, after the gritty opening sequence, it offers quite a sentimental view of war? Yes, that's right, the beginning is very gritty, and that's why it was a real pleasure to work with Tom Hanks. This is here, surely, because of the reception to The Village. A reception that frankly seems positive after the reception to, well, Lady, but also almost everything else after. Shyamalan had been hurt by the lukewarm reception to The Village, but he didn't try to learn from it. He, in a way, doubled down, just to see rejected criticism to Lady in the Water.
You know, I know how to make movies in the system, you know what I mean? I know what's asked from others, I know what's asked of me, you know, and, that can become constricting.
There were people who could speak truth to Shyamalan, but he seems to have shut them down. I imagine, being as successful as he is, it's very hard to see through the bullshit. I'm on the plate-spinning end of things, and often, not always, but often, people are very, very complimentary. And thanks. But if, no matter who you are, you just listen to people who kiss your ass, you lose the ability to build on constructive criticism, and you risk eliminating the possibility of improving yourself. And so too, actual criticism becomes irksome. People had problems with The Village, but I'm the best filmmaker around right now, aren't I? Aren't I? Well, I'll prove I am. Shyamalan wouldn't be told, but he doubted the movie too. Originally he planned to front half of the budget, potentially netting him an enormous profit if the film did well. But he didn't. The number of unforced errors are too numerous to count. Shyamalan didn't want to drive more than 45 minutes from his home to the set, so they built an apartment complex that looks like it should be in Florida or LA, but the film is set in Philadelphia. Yes, they built this apartment complex just for the film. What a waste of money. He also insisted on hiring Chris Doyle, a prolific and talented director of photography, who, nevertheless, had a well-documented and self-confessed problem with alcohol and working on a rigorous shoot. Shyamalan also didn't get enough coverage. He couldn't focus. He was always thinking about the next thing, never what he was working on now. The self-doubt, the second-guessing, these are things artists endure, and they're good things too, because without them, you end up believing your own hype. But they came from Shyamalan knowing his script wasn't ready, and that people weren't really connecting with it, but insisting, I guess to himself as well as others, that it was all fine, because he was great.
Yeah, I think they're digging it. At first I think they were like, what kind of movies are you making? But I think now they're digging it.
Many people who make big movies do it to pay the rent, or really to pay a lot of rent. Shyamalan wasn't making Lady for that. He was making it to make himself feel better, and what he produced was masturbatory nonsense. And it could have all been avoided if he'd just listened to Nina Jacobson, if he'd have just listened to anyone, if he had listened to no one even, if he'd just looked at the script and thought, does calling Bryce Howard a Madam Narf sound a bit stupid? If you want any more confirmation that M. Night wasn't willing to really hear out criticism from people, he held the test screenings at his own luxurious cinema at his home. 39 of 40 testers gave it a positive review. But Michael Bamberger, who's very honest, but is a Shyamalan fan, and who really clearly did want the film to do well, describes viewing the film for the first time as a devastating experience. I'm sure he wasn't the only one. Lady cost $70 million to make and brought in less than 73, but Warner Brothers reportedly spent another $70 million on marketing. I'll finish by comparing Shyamalan's role on The Lady in the Water to a boxer. When a boxer is struck in the face, they can take stock, correct their defensive error, and fight back. Or they can become emotional, go in swinging, and lose it all. But there you go. I do hope that Shyamalan's upcoming film, Glass, is a return to form, and I think it might well be. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me. See you next time, where I'll be talking about remakes, why they're hard to get right, but why, sometimes, they do work. See you then.
And I want to see, when they do that kind of thing at some film festival and they show, clips from all my movies, I want to be, proud, chin up and staring at it and going, yeah.
And please, don't sell out or we'll come after you.
Yeah, exactly.